Imagine a pill that hands you back your appetite for life. One capsule, and a wave of calm rolls over you. You feel light and full of energy, and a smile spreads across your face on its own. The joy of simple things comes back, and you feel like someone lifted off the entire weight you'd been carrying for years. That's exactly how they sold the miracle happiness pill, a drug that was going to change absolutely everything and do it without a single consequence. Sounds tempting, doesn't it? Every single day, tens of millions of people around the world swallow antidepressants. In England alone, doctors wrote out more than 83 million prescriptions in the year 2021, and the global market generated revenue somewhere around $18 billion. And according to the forecasts over the next few years, it's set to grow by more than 100%. Welcome to a world where actually treating depression slides into second place. In this video, you'll see just how cynically this golden business was built, and how all of us became subjects in the largest medical experiment ever run, one fueled by our own suffering. To really understand the situation we're in today, let's take a quick look back at how this whole thing actually started, the 1980s. A brand new drug shows up on the market, Prozac. A tiny little capsule billed as a miracle cure for depression was brought to market back in 1988 by the pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly, wrapped in a storm of media hype and these enormous promises. And the older depression drugs out there came loaded with all kinds of nasty side effects, plus a very real risk of overdose. Prozac was the first in a series of SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and according to the makers, these were supposed to be safer and more effective. The buzz around this brand new drug felt a whole lot more like the launch of a new iPhone than the release of some pharmaceutical product. The media frenzy was enormous, and Prozac hadn't even hit the shelves yet. The marketing worked absolute wonders because instead of all that complicated scientific jargon, they just kept the language plain and simple. This drug fixes a chemical imbalance deep inside your brain and brings your happiness right back. And even the name itself was dreamed up by a professional branding agency. Pro was meant to sound professional, and Zac was just meant to be short, punchy, and easy to remember. The drug bled into pop culture almost overnight. It showed up in movies, in songs, and it got name-dropped across TV series, the Prozac generation. That's how people started describing anyone who trusted this little pill to hand them the peace of mind they were after. By the end of the 1990s, Prozac had become the most prescribed drug in its class anywhere in the world. It brought Eli Lilly a full 25% of the company's total revenue, which back in 1999 came to a staggering $10 billion. So Prozac became a symbol, something that shifted the way we think about our own emotions and our weaknesses. It was supposed to help not just with depression, but with low self-esteem and shyness, even the fear of being rejected. Ads and articles kept hinting that thanks to this pill, you could become someone better, someone more confident, more sociable, more productive. Then in 1991, the FDA went ahead and held hearings over reports of a rising suicide risk in some of the patients taking Prozac. And while no clear link was established at the time and sales just carried on, the drug had already started picking up some pretty mixed reviews. Dr. Peter Kramer warned against this whole growing phenomenon of perfectly healthy people taking the drug just to fine-tune their own personality, but Prozac sales kept climbing anyway. Rival companies just kept rolling out more and more SSRIs, and antidepressants were becoming as completely ordinary as popping a pill for a headache. Like I mentioned earlier, Prozac's whole success was built on one simple message. Depression comes from a chemical imbalance in the brain, specifically a shortage of serotonin that the SSRIs were there to top back up. Kind of like insulin for a diabetic, where the end result is your mood restored to normal. It was a story so easy to grasp and so comforting that everyone bought into it: patients, doctors, the media, even a lot of medical authorities. Here's the problem: this narrative was never confirmed by actual science. The serotonin hypothesis had been around since the 1960s. For decades it stayed just one theory of depression among many. And it took the marketing offensive of the 1990s to turn it into a slogan: depression equals too little serotonin. The ads were full of the sleek animated graphics showing the missing molecules right there in your synapses, and the magic little pills that fill them all back in. Simple message: feeling down? That's a serotonin shortage, and our drug will fix it. That slogan seeped into mass culture so effectively that, according to surveys, a full 85% of the public came to believe the theory. So what does the reality actually look like? After several decades of research, no convincing evidence was ever found that depression stems from any specific shortage of serotonin at all. In July 2022, a groundbreaking scientific review came out, the so-called Umbrella Review. It pulled together decades of research on the link between serotonin and depression. And the conclusions were brutal because not one single area of research turned up consistent evidence of any link to depression. People with depression didn't consistently show lower serotonin levels than healthy people. There was no difference in the so-called serotonin genes either, and even experiments that artificially lowered serotonin in healthy people through diet still failed to trigger any depression. As the study's lead author puts it, Professor Joanna Moncrief of University College London, after all these long years of research, we can now say with complete and total certainty that there is no evidence depression is caused by any disturbance in serotonin. And this discovery completely undercuts the entire narrative that drug prescribing had rested on for decades. The SSRIs really do affect serotonin levels in the brain, but there's no evidence that a shortage of it is what triggers depression. What's more, there are signs that taking SSRIs long-term may lower the brain's own natural serotonin activity. The body compensates for the drug, artificially pumping those levels up. And over the long run, the whole balance can end up tipping in the opposite direction. And this is exactly what explains why suddenly stopping the pills so often ends in a sudden violent crash in mood. The brain gets lazy and complacent with that constant presence of the drug, and it can't just snap back to producing those neurotransmitters normally overnight. One thing really worth adding here is that serotonin really does play a role in how the brain works, but there's no simple mechanism where low serotonin simply means you catch depression. Depression is a complex state, biological, psychological, social, which is why SSRIs don't work by filling some gap. They just modify how signals get passed around in the brain. And even so, for a lot of patients, it doesn't bring much improvement. But the simple story is sold really well. The pharmaceutical companies poured enormous resources into spreading it everywhere, from leaflets in doctors' offices to sponsored conferences for physicians, all the way to product placement in pop culture. And even though scientists had their doubts right from the start, their voices just got drowned out in the collective awe over these miraculous happiness pills. It's only now, after about 30 years, that the reckoning is finally arriving. Meanwhile, generations of patients were convinced they had to swallow a powder to top up some missing substance in their brain. And this has its dark side. Studies show that people convinced their depression has a purely biological cause, they turn out far more pessimistic about their odds of recovery. They figure that if it's a flaw in their brain chemistry, then without the drug, they just can't cope. Paradoxically, the serotonin fairy tale may have left patients feeling even more dependent on the drugs and more helpless against their illness. Because how are you supposed to fight something with therapy or a lifestyle change when it's supposedly buried deep in your synapses? Long before Prozac, the world had been through another drug revolution in psychiatry: benzodiazepines. The 60s and 70s were the era of Valium and Xanax, which quickly took over the market for sedatives and anti-anxiety drugs. Back in 1963, Valium was launched as a miracle remedy for anxiety, a safer alternative to the barbiturates. Those were the older drugs, the ones that hooked you fast, and patients all too often ended their own lives by overdosing on them. Valium was so popular that between 1969 and 1982, it was the single most prescribed drug right across the entire United States. By the mid-70s, around 14% of American adults had a standing benzo prescription. They were thought practically non-addictive. The Rolling Stones wrote a whole hit about them, and family doctors handed out scripts by the fistful to stressed-out suburbanites. The head of clinical pharmacology at Massachusetts General Hospital once declared, "I have never seen a single case of addiction to benzodiazepines." It's hard to believe that today, because we now know they are powerfully addictive, both psychologically and physically. And by the end of the 70s, the first alarming reports of abuse and withdrawal symptoms had started surfacing. By the 1980s, it had become perfectly clear that mass addiction to Valium was a fact. Especially since people kept pushing their doses higher and attempts to quit ended in anxiety, in insomnia, in tremors, even full-blown seizures. Benzodiazepines started getting tightly restricted, with warnings against any long-term use. And this is right where the SSRI antidepressants come marching onto the scene, dressed all in white. In the marketing story at least, they started being advertised not just as drugs for depression, but as an alternative to the benzos for anxiety disorders too, and they were never placed on the controlled substances list. So a patient could walk out with a prescription for a several-month supply. Patients who'd been taking antidepressants for years discovered something deeply unsettling. When they tried to quit, they went through an absolute nightmare. The SSRI withdrawal syndrome turned out to be very real, and for many people, severe. Yet for years it was brushed aside by the makers and by some doctors, who simply called it mild discontinuation symptoms. The mechanism is different from the benzodiazepines, but the end result can look much the same. A person becomes physically dependent on that daily dose just to function normally. And what's worse, medicine spent a long time refusing to accept this fact at all. Just like in the days of Valium, the existence of the whole problem was institutionally denied. As recently as 20 years ago, the dominant position was that antidepressants simply don't cause dependence. At most, they said, the depression just comes back once you stop. Today, we know that isn't entirely true. Depression really can return if the drugs are stopped too quickly, but there are also independent withdrawal symptoms, ones with no connection to the original illness at all. What's more, for some patients, coming off SSRIs turns out to be harder than coming off benzodiazepines. Sounds controversial? And yet, a 2020 analysis showed that the symptoms after antidepressants are often longer and far more varied than the ones after benzos. In practice, that means a certain share of patients ended up stuck on antidepressants for years on end. Not because they still need them therapeutically, but because they simply cannot endure the side effects of cutting the dose. For the pharmaceutical industry, this might be a cynically convenient thing, since it hands them steady, long-term customers. But for patients, it's a tragedy, a feeling of being trapped in a psychopharmacological cage. The most common symptom is anxiety, sometimes paired with dizziness, with insomnia, with violent mood swings. Sometimes it tips over into disorientation and a complete loss of balance. It can look like a classic case of the flu, the aching muscles, the exhaustion, the nausea, but there are far stranger experiences too. Waves of an odd tingling roll right through the body. Inside the head come electrical discharges, like faint little jolts of current, the so-called brain zaps. Sounds horrifying? For thousands of people around the world, these are very real, lived experiences. Britain's health institutions have only recently admitted that the antidepressant withdrawal syndrome can be severe and long-lasting, and that doctors really should be warning patients about it and helping them taper off their doses safely. According to a sweeping analysis of 24 studies, published back in 2019 in the journal Addictive Behaviors, as many as 56% of patients may experience withdrawal symptoms, and nearly half of them rate those symptoms as severe. Usually they last a few weeks, but the variation here is enormous. In some people, the symptoms drag on for months and even longer than a year. And what's worse, a lot of doctors misread them as a relapse of the depression. And instead of helping the patient get off the drug, they raise the dose or restart the therapy, sealing the patient inside a vicious circle. And the truly shocking part is just how few patients were ever prepared for this in any way at all. Most people say they got no guidance whatsoever from their doctor on how to come off antidepressants, and they never heard a single warning about the potential side effects of taking and quitting the drug. Grassroots patient movements actually played a huge role in dragging this whole problem into the light, because thanks to their pressure, some doctors began specializing in helping people taper off SSRIs. There's even now an International Institute for Safe Withdrawal from Psychiatric Drugs, bringing together psychiatrists and psychologists from Britain, from Sweden, from Finland, among others. One of the faces of this whole movement is Dr. Mark Horowitz, a psychiatrist and neuroscientist who lived through powerful withdrawal symptoms himself as a patient. It was only after he'd been through that personal hell of coming off the drug that he began studying the problem scientifically and helping to write the guidelines for gentle dose reduction. We now know that for people who've taken antidepressants long-term, safely coming off the dose should take many months and sometimes years with tiny gradual reductions, often something like 10% of the dose per month or even slower than that. The old standard used to be tapering off over 2 or 4 weeks, which in a great many cases turned out to be far, far too fast. And the withdrawal syndrome is not the only hidden side effect of antidepressants. The list is long, and over the years, a number of these effects were downplayed or wiped clean out of the discussion, all to keep from spoiling the image of the happiness drugs. Here are just a few examples. Anhedonia and emotional blunting. Patients report less sadness and less anxiety, but also no joy, no love, no empathy. They feel cut off from their emotions as if they were living under a heavy muffle. And studies do confirm that SSRIs can cause exactly this kind of emotional flattening. Next up, we have sexual dysfunction, one of the most common effects of all. In studies, this hits somewhere between 30 and 70% of patients. Plenty of doctors said, it'll pass. The problem is, it doesn't always pass. There are documented cases of young people who lost their sexual sensitivity for years after the therapy was over. And the European Medicines Agency only ordered that warning onto the leaflets back in 2019, which means that for all those years before, patients had absolutely no idea such a risk even existed. Long-term antidepressant therapy is also linked to weight gain. The patient climbs out of depression only to wake up with a brand new problem: obesity, the kind that wrecks whatever was left of their self-esteem. And while it isn't conclusively proven, the suspicion is that SSRIs, much like the older drugs before them, also alter the metabolism and ramp up the appetite, and the end result is a rising risk of insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. Suicidal thoughts and behavior in the young is the hardest subject of all, because already in the 1990s there were signals that in some teenagers SSRIs were making their condition worse. More anxiety, more agitation, and on top of that, an impulse towards self-harm. The pharmaceutical companies kept batting these accusations away, but the evidence just kept mounting. In 2004, the FDA slapped a warning onto every single antidepressant about the suicide risk in people under the age of 18, and later they extended it all the way up to the age of 24. The mechanism is simple. The drug brings back energy faster than it lifts the mood. So the end result is a young person who still feels terrible, but now has more strength to act on their very darkest thoughts. GSK's own secret analysis of paroxetine revealed that the risk of suicide attempts among teenagers ran several times higher than in the placebo group. Akathisia is a little known but genuinely dangerous side effect. It's the name for a state of inner restlessness and agitation. The patient literally can't sit still. They feel like they are about to jump out of their own skin, and it can lead to aggression or to taking one's own life. Such cases were already noted in the Prozac trials back in the 1980s. Eli Lilly's own internal memos from 1990, brought to light later on, suggested that in their reports the term suicide attempt should be changed to overdose, and suicidal thoughts changed to depression. The whole point was simply to bury the problem. The German regulator, back in 1984, rejected Prozac precisely because of akathisia. It calculated that suicide attempts on Prozac were 5 times more frequent than on the older antidepressants, and 3 times more frequent than on placebo. And yet, Lilly got its way and pushed the drug onto the market anyway, with the warning only appearing on the leaflets many years later. Let's add to all of this the cognitive and memory problems too, because some patients complain of a mental fog, of weaker concentration, of struggling to find their words. The research here is mixed, since depression itself also impairs memory. But there are studies pointing to cognitive changes after SSRIs. For instance, a worse ability to read emotions in other people. None of this means that every single patient experiences all of these effects. Plenty of people go through the therapy with no major problems, but the fact remains that the pharmaceutical industry systematically smoothed over the profile of adverse effects. So it's no wonder that patients lost their trust in them. More and more of them are asking, why did nobody ever tell me about this? And the answer is simple, because the truth was bad for business. The billions in profits from antidepressant sales are also the product of all kinds of manipulation of the scientific data. Through the 1990s and the 2000s, the pharmaceutical companies played this absolutely masterfully. Mostly the positive trial results got published, while the negative ones got buried in a drawer. They also paid off experts and entire conferences, all to push these drugs as the first-line solution on a truly massive scale. Take the publication of clinical trials. Back in 2008, a genuinely terrifying fact came to light. According to the published literature, a full 94% of antidepressant trials had a positive result, suggesting the drug actually worked. But once the FDA's registration data was analyzed, including the unpublished trials, it turned out that in reality only 51% of the trials showed the drug beating placebo. So half the trials were negative or inconclusive, but the majority of those were never published at all. That means the doctors reading the literature were getting a completely falsified picture. This kind of cherry-picking of results is nothing other than a plain form of scientific fraud. And let's stress this, because it's the crucial problem here. A doctor can act in total good faith, really wanting to help, but the knowledge they draw on comes from literature handed to them by the drug industry. That literature is filtered to fit the corporation's interests, and the end result is a doctor repeating a narrative that was assembled beforehand in a marketing department. The patient trusts the doctor, and that's how the system closes in on itself, the system where suffering becomes a business. You could compare it to the media. Even if a journalist wanted to be objective and acted in good faith, which in the mainstream press is impossible anyway, since nobody will ever let them, they'd still face the same question: which sources are actually reliable? And in medicine, it works much the same way. Take the famous study 329 on paroxetine. the antidepressant sold under the name Paxil, or Seroxat, by the company GlaxoSmithKline. Back in 2001, a study came out in a respected journal, and its conclusion was crystal clear. Paroxetine is safe and effective for teenagers with depression. Doctors were told they could go ahead and prescribe it to young people. The problem is, it was a lie. The raw data, only brought to light in court cases, showed something completely the opposite: no effectiveness and a heightened suicide risk. Hardly anyone knew that the article had been written by a man on GSK's payroll, and that many of the co-authors had never even seen the full data. It took 14 long years, until 2015, for independent scientists to reanalyze study 329 and reveal the truth. That story became a symbol of fraud in clinical research, and that is far from the end of it. GSK never published 2 other negative studies in young people, and instead, for years and years on end, it kept laying on all these elegant dinners, the spa seminars, the fully sponsored getaways, and all of it was just to convince the doctors that this drug really and truly worked. And then, in 2012, GlaxoSmithKline pleaded guilty and paid a full $3 billion fine for illegal marketing and for hiding the data. It was the largest fine in the history of the pharmaceutical industry, but the harm done to those teenagers, the thousands of lives wrecked, can never now be undone. And as you've probably already guessed, this was no exception. Eli Lilly, the maker of Prozac I mentioned earlier, already knew about the akathisia and suicide risk back in the 1980s, but in its official materials, it flatly denied it. Pfizer, the maker of Zoloft, another hugely popular antidepressant, sponsored conferences and publications suggesting it worked in teenagers. Emails leaked that laid their cynicism bare. We need to neutralize Dr. X because he's undermining the effectiveness of our drug. That meant very real pressure on researchers, on journals, even on universities. The case of Professor David Haley is a notorious one. He lost a job offer after he publicly criticized Prozac. The marketing operated on so many fronts. Sales reps would drop by doctors' offices, leaving little gadgets behind and funding vacations. And in the United States, they went even further. Television ads. They showed how, the moment you swallow the pill, happiness instantly appears. There were sponsored guidelines too. Through the 2000s, the American Psychiatric Association was recommending aggressive drug treatment, and only later did it come out that most of the experts writing those recommendations were on the payroll of the drug makers. It's hard to expect any warnings about side effects in a report financed by the pharmaceutical industry. Another mechanism was simply changing the very definition of illnesses, because the wider you describe some disorder, the more patients you reel in, and that's exactly how, in the 2000s, ordinary sadness or grief often got classified as depression, and the solution? A prescription pill, of course. Even before any therapy or any change in lifestyle, whenever the patents were running out, the companies dreamed up brand new markets. The classic example? Prozac. Right before its patent protection expired, Eli Lilly brought the very same drug back out under a different name, Sarafem. A pink package and a brand new illness, PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. It was meant to be a distinctly female drug for mood swings. In practice, it was just plain old Prozac, only sold in a brand new package. Critics called it exactly what it was, the creation of a market by medicalizing women's emotions. Doctors also recall that back in those days, the new antidepressants were presented to them as almost miraculous, effective, safe, and entirely free of side effects. The patients who believed them paid for it with their health. As Harvard's Professor Erwin Kersh points out, the pharmaceutical companies have perfected the art of manufacturing the illusion of effectiveness. So, does that mean the drugs are useless? No, but the effect of antidepressants is definitely nowhere near as miraculous as the picture we were all sold. Depression has become one of the most commonly diagnosed illnesses on the planet, and the drugs for it are among the most frequently prescribed of all. And that means an enormous market. Western societies lead the way in antidepressant consumption, and though Poland long lagged behind, that's now changing at a very rapid pace. Data from Poland's Public Health Fund, the NFZ, shows that back in 2014, Poland sold around 7 million packs of prescription antidepressants, and by 2022, already over 30 million packs of SSRIs. So the scale is enormous and it's climbing every single year. What's driving this rise? Part of it, of course, is simply better detection of depression, and that for once is a genuinely positive thing. More people are reaching out for help instead of suffering somewhere in silence. but the data suggests the drugs are increasingly prescribed just in case, and by doctors who aren't even psychiatrists. In Poland, half of all diagnosed patients are treated solely by primary care doctors. They get their antidepressant prescriptions there, often with no parallel therapy at all. And this matters because a family doctor usually has only a dozen odd minutes per patient and isn't always trained in detailed psychiatric diagnosis, so the simplest course of action is just to write out a prescription. Poland is short on psychiatrists, the NFZ waiting lists are long, and private care is expensive, so the end result is that a pill becomes a quick substitute for proper care. The same thing is happening with children and teenagers. In Poland, the number of minors taking antidepressants has nearly tripled over the last decade. All of this generates costs for the health system. The NFZ reimburses part of these drugs, and the spending on them keeps rising. In 2021, the NFZ spent over $48 million reimbursing antidepressants. By contrast, for therapy and psychological counseling, only about $8 million was set aside. These numbers make it painfully clear which model of treating depression dominates here, so it's hard to argue that the goal is actually curing the patient. So who's making money off all this? The big corporations. That much is obvious, but there's also a whole army of middlemen, the pharmaceutical wholesalers, the pharmacies, the doctors hired on as consultants or speakers, and the training firms running conferences, which are very often sponsored by the industry itself. Depression has become a market of its own. We've got World Depression Awareness Days, sponsored, for instance, by foundations tied to the drug makers. And we've got these public campaigns nobly encouraging people to seek treatment. That's good, but the subtext is often a single message. Go to a doctor for help. Read for a prescription. In Poland, for instance, there was a manufacturer-funded program that ran for years and years, pushing psychiatric consultations for patients in primary care. Let's take a guess at what these consultations so often resulted in. A prescription, of course. And that's not an accusation, because it's good that patients reached a specialist. It's just worth being aware that Big Pharma invests in these campaigns not purely out of philanthropy, but out of business calculation too. The marketing spending of the pharmaceutical giants is globally simply staggering. In the United States, the industry has long spent more on promotion than on research into new drugs, and it pays off, especially in the antidepressant segment. Prozac was the golden goose right up until 2001, until the patent expired and the cheaper generics showed up. But Eli Lilly didn't cry for very long, because by then it was already rolling out Cymbalta for depression and anxiety, along with Zyprexa, an antipsychotic that became its next big sales hit. GlaxoSmithKline after Paxil shifted over to other areas, though generic paroxetine still brings in the profits. Pfizer had Zoloft and later acquired the company making F-Fax, or that is, venlafaxine. To this day, it's one of the most frequently prescribed drugs there is. And let's add that in 2019, Johnson & Johnson entered the market with esketamine under the brand Spravato, an innovative but extremely expensive nasal spray for severe depression. The new segment was named treatment-resistant depression, and it's already generated revenue in the billions. You can see it plainly here. The corporations keep rotating their products, but the number of patients doesn't drop at all. Quite the opposite. The patient pays for this twice, out of their own pocket, buying the drugs and paying for visits, and as a taxpayer financing the NFZ, which reimburses part of these products. If the drug genuinely helps and saves a life, then that is, without any doubt, money very well spent. But what about the situation where someone spends hundreds of dollars a month for years on a drug therapy that changes very little and at the same time was never given a shot at therapy? Depression is a real, severe illness. The WHO ranks it among the leading causes of disability in the entire world. So no reasonable person is going to say we shouldn't be investing in treatment. But the question is whether we're investing wisely, given that in Poland in 2021, about $48 million went to antidepressants and only $8 million to therapy and psychological counseling. The answer practically writes itself. In all of this, it's all too easy to slide into a one-sided tone of condemnation. So, for the sake of balance, let's say it plainly. A great many people owe their life or their health to antidepressants. This can't be brushed aside, because for someone sunk deep in severe depression, who isn't eating, isn't sleeping, and thinks only of how to end it all, waiting around for therapy to work might not be an option at all. You have to act in the moment first, and it's often antidepressants, precisely, that let a person break through the very deepest crisis. They give the energy to get out of bed, they quiet the intrusive thoughts, And that person says afterward, "This drug saved me. I don't know if I'd be alive today if it weren't for it." And that too is the truth. Epidemiological studies have shown more than once that rising access to antidepressants correlates with a drop in suicide rates. Of course, correlation is not proof of causation. Other factors could have played a part as well, like public campaigns or a general improvement in psychological care. Even so, the European Psychiatric Association recognizes antidepressant pharmacotherapy as one of the best documented methods of preventing deaths by suicide, alongside cognitive behavioral therapy. And antidepressants don't actually work only on depression. They have a whole range of medical uses, from treating neuropathic pain, duloxetine, for instance, which helps with diabetic pain. So we can't just sit here and demonize an entire class of drug altogether. It's a tool that, when it's used properly, can bring real relief to a great many sufferers. In this video, what I'm showing you is the pathology of this whole system and its darker sides. But the point is absolutely not to tell a person suffering from depression, throw out your drugs, because Big Pharma is making money off you. Absolutely not. What I mean is awareness and balance. The awareness that drugs are not candy and they do have side effects. They can be hard to come off and they aren't always essential. And balance in approaching the fact that treating depression isn't just about taking pills. For full health, what's crucial is therapy, social support, and changes in lifestyle. Sleep, physical activity, diet, and sometimes help in solving very real-life problems like death, violence, or loneliness. Fortunately, there were always people keeping a close watch on the pharmaceutical companies. And there are employees too who, after years, finally break their silence. In the story of Prozac, one name surfaced, Claude Bouchy. He was the head of Eli Lilly in Germany, who back in 1990 wrote to headquarters that he could not explain to a regulator nor to a patient's family why on earth they should be changing the reports on suicide attempts on Prozac. His honesty was ignored at the time, but the memo survived in the archives and came to light in court cases. Thanks to that, we know just how cynically the whole question of safety was handled, and it's hard not to feel anger once you realize just how heartless this system can be. In the middle of the ocean, the silence is torn apart by an explosion. A drilling platform stands in flames, and people are fighting desperately for their lives. And unfortunately, that's only the beginning, because deep underwater, oil is being released. A spill so vast you can see it from space. How was it possible that, at the time, BP was telling the whole world that nothing had happened? Click the thumbnail and see the disaster BP hid the truth about. This is Cold Lemon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in just a moment.